And some housekeeping points. Firstly, this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Nature Masterclasses website next year. So today we're going to be covering a number of key questions that came in during the registration process. However, we will also have time for live questions at the end as well. So as we're going through the webinar, any questions that maybe come up in your mind, please do write them into the question box and we'll get through as many as we have time for. I would also like to highlight that closed captioning is available in English. You can turn that on by selecting the button that's towards the bottom of your screen. And you can also adjust the ratio of the view between the slides and the speakers by dragging the slider that's in the middle of your screen. If you do have any technical difficulties, please let us know at Nature Masterclasses online at nature.com. And finally, please keep in mind that the views being discussed today are those of the panelists and not of Springer Nature. And always remember that because AI is a rapidly evolving field and policies are rapidly evolving alongside them, please always be up to date with AI guidelines and policies that are being set by your institution, funder, country, and or publisher. Our goal is by the end of this webinar that you'll have greater confidence in using AI tools more responsibly and effectively in your work. So I would like to first start off today with a brief poll, trying to find out how many of you that are or so to select an answer. Okay, well, I can see it's a little bit less than half of you have already registered, and many of you have already dipped in and taken some of the courses, which is great. A little over half have not yet done so, which is perfectly fine. Please do remember, though, your institution is subscribing to this platform to support your career development, so it's completely free to you, and we'll give you opportunities to register throughout the webinar today and encourage you to check out the available courses. Thank you so much. So let's now, just for a brief introduction about Nature Masterclasses on Demand for the over 50% of you that maybe are not that familiar, that you have the courses that are available to you at your institution. These are developed with researchers in mind, and they feature leading experts, industry professionals, nature portfolio editors, and active researchers. And we do understand as very busy researchers, we've designed the courses to really allow you to dip in and dip out during your availability throughout your busy workday. Altogether, we do have over 20 courses that really cover the entire research cycle, with guidance from research design all the way through publication, how to work with others, as well as taking the next steps in your career. Now, one of our core offering includes our recently updated suite of courses on scientific writing and publishing. And so if you want to build your knowledge in writing and publishing, please do visit the links or the QR codes found on the screen. And today's webinar is really aiming to supplement all these courses that you can see available by delving into how AI can and should be used during the writing and publishing process. Now, as publishers, of course, the influence of AI on writing and publishing, as well as the associated impact on research communities we serve, is really at the forefront of our minds. AI does have the power to really transform how researchers write and publish, but to maximize efficiency and to support job satisfaction, researchers need to be able to understand and apply it effectively. And this can be a challenge. I mean, publishers are still trying to define what's acceptable, what needs to be disclosed. There's growing pressure in the research community to adapt to these new expectations, evolving ethics, as well as continuous publication pressures. So we're curious to see how researchers like you are using AI at the moment, which brings us to our second poll today. Go ahead and launch the second poll. Thank you. Okay, I can see, well, but 75% of you have already used AI. Many of you have found it quite helpful. Others have not really used it yet. Maybe will in the future, however. Thank you very much. Now, that actually is quite similar to the trends that we see in surveys that we at Nature have done. This was a survey with nearly 4,000 PhD candidates around the world, where we found about 50% of PhD students are using AI on a weekly basis. The majority, 75%, do find it to help them boost their efficiency, but a large majority are also a bit cautious on whether or not they can trust these AI tools. And this resonates with another poll that we had done earlier this year as well, with over 5,000 researchers around the world across various career levels, where 90% felt AI could be useful for editing or translation. About 2/3 feel it could be useful for drafting a paper from an outline, as long as researchers are going to be editing the content afterwards. But where we do see a lot of variability is in terms of whether or not researchers should disclose that use of AI in these use cases in their papers. What was also really another interesting trend was, although many researchers felt that AI could be useful in many of these use cases, shown in the blue bars, the number of researchers actually using them for these use cases was considerably lower. And what that suggests to us, is that while many of the researchers feel that AI may be useful, they're not really sure how they should be integrating it into their everyday workflows. And so that's really prompted us with the webinar today to help boost that confidence to make sure you're using it responsibly and effectively with your writing as well. Now, related to that, we'd like to see how you're currently using AI in writing and publishing your research, which will bring us to our third and final poll before we get to our panel session. Well, we can see that majority of you are using AI for editing. Not surprising, that's the most common use case. Number of you are using it for translating as well, or maybe preparing summaries. Much fewer are using it for drafting your paper, and some are not using for AI for writing or publishing at all, which is perfectly fine. We've gone along without it for many years, so it's really just a tool to help boost that efficiency. So let's now move on, and I'd like to move on to our panel session now that we have a good foundation to build upon, where we ask you to submit questions upon registration, and we're able to identify 5 key themes as shown on the screen that we're going to be going through. So now, with that said, let's go on to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Ellie Gendel, who's head of journal policy at Springer Nature. So Ellie leads on developing and rolling out editorial policies that keep research publishing fair, transparent, and consistent. She's built her career across academic and educational and healthcare publishing, and now drives Springer Nature approach to journal integrity and policy. Welcome, Ellie.
Hi, nice to be here.
So next we have Dr. Kamar Amin Ali, who's senior lecturer in biomedical science at Teesside University. Kamar's research focuses on how inflammation in the brain contributes to neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, but she's also a passionate communicator, writing and podcasting with dementia researcher to make science more accessible to everyone. So welcome.
Hello.
And then joining us from Nature Portfolio is Dr. Sadar Bakshende, Senior Editor at Nature Reviews Bioengineering and Consulting Editor for Nature Biomedical Engineering. With a background in mechanical and biomedical engineering, Sadar works across the full spectrum of bioengineering research and innovation. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello, everyone.
And finally, and last but not least, we have Dr. Wynand Lambrechts, an electronic engineer and researcher based in South Africa. So Wynand's work covers sustainable energy, semiconductors, and microelectronics. He's author of several technical books and journal articles. Alongside his engineering work, he's a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's nice to be here.
So with that, as I mentioned, we did identify 5 key themes, and we're going to highlight some key questions across those different themes. And let's go ahead and begin with the first theme, which is about the responsible use of and skill development. And so I'd like to first ask Kumar, so do you have any tips for preserving your own voice and intention when using AI to support writing a paper? And how can we avoid all papers sounding the same if everyone's using AI to assist them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think kind of my views reflect a lot of what the polls have shown. And personally, I think that when it comes to the actual writing of papers, really we should be using AI tools as little as possible. So only using them maybe as and when we might need them. So for example, if English isn't your first language, or if you've got accessibility needs, we'll come on to that in a second. But I think those are legitimate reasons for kind of using it. But for the actual writing, we should maybe use it as little as possible, because I think it's not just about a risk in maybe losing your voice or in losing your personal style in your writing, but there's also the issues around, intellectual property and copyright issues related to submitting your unpublished research to one of these tools, because obviously if you're going to be using it for generating content for writing, then that's what you need to do. And then all that information that you're inputting into these tools is going to be used to train their algorithms. And there's a risk of, I think, maybe compromising ownership over your work. And your words really aren't something that you would want to kind of risk compromising. I think there are lots of areas where it can be really useful in terms of making tasks more efficient and synthesizing information to put into notes before the actual writing. But I think for the actual writing of the content, I personally would try to use it as little as possible, as you said, for trying to preserve your own voice and your own style of writing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kumar. And Bernard, could you please also share maybe some of your perspectives or insights on this topic as well?
Yes, Jeff, thanks. And I completely agree with what Kumar said. I think from my side, what I would like to recommend is something that you almost actively engage in a mindset where you only use AI to marginally improve what you've already written, as opposed to generating content to save time. This is in long term, this is beneficial for everyone involved. And if you do it the other way around, it really becomes, you become overly reliant on AI, and there's a few disadvantages that follow. I've seen this in my own work, and also as a supervisor of other researchers and authors. The one thing that I quickly want to mention is there's something for example, in computer generated graphics, it's called the uncanny valley. Now, this is where your brain sort of realizes or sees when someone mimics a face with computer generated graphics, you immediately pick that up because our brains are just trained that way. We see a lot of faces, we know exactly what to expect. And it's the same with writing. If you generate a lot of content using AI, reviewers and the readers do actually pick this up, even if it's difficult to say why and how. Our brains are just programmed to see it in this way. And as I've said, I've seen it in my own work. I've generated a form once, which I did a year or two ago. And after reading it again a few months ago, I picked up that something was just a little bit off. And that's when I remembered that, yes, I did this with AI. And also from students that submitted abstracts, you immediately see that something that the student didn't write this. And as a reviewer, I don't have a problem with that. You can mark a few things and send it back, and then they will usually also see that something that the reviewer has picked it up. And when you receive that back, usually you can see that they've changed it and they've put in um, their own tone into this whole writing. So that would be my feedback.
Yeah, fantastic. I certainly agree, man. And one thing I always try to tell researchers is that, yeah, everyone has their own unique experience, their own unique perspectives. And it's really, I think academic publishing is acting as a forum to share these unique perspectives. And by bringing them together is really what helps to advance the field and science forward. If everyone's using these large language models, we start homogenizing those ideas, which really limits the impact that the research is going to have broadly for the academic community. So I certainly agree with both of you. I think it's really good insights to the writing belongs to the author, and then AI is just to help improve that to make improve clarity or readability. Right. So next question is on our second theme, which is on language equity and inclusion. And I'd like to first address this to our editorial colleague, Sidrar. So what AI tools are available to support non-English speakers and researchers with accessibility needs?
Thanks, Jeff. I mean, there's lots of tools nowadays. I think new ones are coming out probably every hour, I would say. And like now, the public ones, I think they're quite efficient at many things. Given the right instructions and prompts, I think they would probably deliver lots of things. But there are more like specialized ones as well. I mean, you do have like the conventional ones for language support, translational tools, like some writing and editing assistants. But like for the sake of this question in particular, I would say those that are more related to people with disabilities, perhaps. There are some tools that are, on the lines of speech to text or text to speech tools. Google has some softwares on that, like Google Lookout, for instance, like is to assist visually impaired users to identify like text and identify objects. Microsoft Dictate also is quite useful in that sense. But not only those, like also for people who are visually impaired, perhaps, we have like Microsoft Immersive Reader, for instance, or other tools which are, screen readers with some Braille support. So there's a lot of things that people could use, a bit more scientific perhaps and less tailored for people with disabilities. There's a lot of things here again. So from the academic side, we would have AI tools which offer smart citations. So I found like Cite AI pretty useful in that sense. I use Semantic Scholar, like Research Rabbit, and also like other network-based AI tools which connect papers, which usually helps me to find referees, perhaps connect relevant papers and see whether something is new or perhaps less new compared to what has already been published.
Fantastic. I agree. There are a lot of this. Does seem like on an hourly basis, new tools are constantly being released. Kumar, could you please also maybe share some of your perspectives on this topic as well?
Yeah, so I think as Cedra said, that there's the ones that kind of the specialized tools, but actually a lot of apps and software that we use every day kind of have these now inbuilt, and that can be really, really useful for people who might have accessibility needs. So there's a number that have already been mentioned in terms of, that are capable of reading on-screen text aloud. This can be really beneficial for people that have visual impairments or dyslexia, for example. I know there's one called Read Aloud. It's part of Microsoft 365, so it integrates quite well with other Microsoft products, which are commonly used. And you've also got tools that work the other way, that convert speech to text, so they almost work like I don't know if many people know what a dictaphone is anymore, but dictaphones used to be used quite a lot, especially in kind of clinical settings. But there's these softwares that work in a similar way to that now. Really helpful for people with physical disabilities, injuries that might affect their ability to write. I have a colleague at the moment who's injured his hand, and he's writing his emails using that type of software. He said that it's good, but it doesn't. There's a lot of correcting he has to do for his accent, so they're not perfect, but they are getting better. And I think as well, for people who might not have English as a first language, there are obviously good tools for translation, Google Translate, Google Lens, really good for kind of summarizing text or simplifying it into more accessible language.
Yeah, fantastic. I think it is something people often not really ignore, but don't really. It's not really at the front of their minds. And we think about AI really supporting non-native English speakers to be able to more effectively communicate ideas, these complex ideas in English. But it's also about reaching those people with accessibility needs that really helps to democratize academic publishing on a global scale. So thank you very much for sharing that. So our next theme, a very important one to many researchers worldwide, is surrounding ethics and integrity and accountability. And I can't think of anyone better to help us with this than our very own Ellie. So I'll ask you the first question in this theme. So what measures are journals and publishers taking to prevent misinformation, fabricated data, or false claims arising from AI-generated content?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jeff. I think it's sort of we've taken a multi-pronged approach, I guess. From a policy perspective, we're revisiting our AI policies all the time, trying to sort of keep pace with how the tech is developing, but also how our different stakeholders might be interacting with it, be that authors, reviewers, editors. We need to kind of have policies that make sense across that whole landscape. And we, like other publishers, develop a sort of a technology response, I guess. So developing tools or sort of pattern identification that will help us or flag to us when we think there might be fabricated data or false claims or misinformation. But the one thing we always circle back to, and I would sort of promote this with anyone's use of AI, it is that sort of human in the loop, human verification follow-up. And so whereas we might initially flag something of concern using a tool, we would then follow up with expertise, and a human would analyze that and look at it. And there are markers, as you say, as I think Vinod very cleverly mentioned it initially, there are sort of just textual clues that make you think, oh, that doesn't sound right to me. And it's kind of superfluous prose, or it's misuse of technological language that doesn't quite fit, and it just sounds off when you read it back to yourself. And so actually we really rely on the expertise of our reviewers and our editors to pick up those sort of nuanced measures. And sorry, just to circle back to the policy bit, and also to sort of play into that non-native English speaker challenge, which obviously many of our researchers have. They're trying to polish the language of their paper. They're using AI for a sort of, a final polish. I would always recommend getting a native English speaker to just have a quick once over on that, because sometimes the suggestion that comes from AI editing, although it sort of grammatically is correct, it's not how a native English speaker would have said it. And if you haven't declared the use of that somewhere, as a publisher, we might take that as a red flag, like, oh, hang on a minute, is this AI generated? And it isn't. And I think that's a sort of a pitfall that we don't really want to unfairly penalise non-native English speakers, that they might fall into that. So always a human in the loop is great. And as I say, I think the tools for this kind of accountability will keep developing, but we'll always need that human verification.
Yes, certainly. I think it also kind of circles back to what Menard mentioned earlier, that the human brain can just recognize what's natural from what we're used to, familiar with, compared with something that's a bit unnatural, maybe generated by AI. Why that human in the loop is so crucial. Thank you very much for sharing that, Ellie. So Dar, from an editorial perspective, I'd really be happy to hear some of your perspectives and insights on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the company level, there are efforts going on, of course. So we're trying to, I think in publishing in general, we're trying to move a little bit from just simple disclosure requirements and accountability to like active screenings. And I think Ellie already mentioned everything, but the company had some like Gepetto and the type of tools that we know the company is using it to identify, I don't know, fake images or AI-generated text and so on. But my bit as an editor is that still the overall process is very much trust-based. So when I receive referee reports, I can with a very high chance, like tell that this is, luckily it doesn't happen that often, but I can say that like this is an AI generated report. Now, there is no way for me to prove that. There's still a way. This is something that we have to keep in mind. So that's what I mean by being trust-based. But this already, you know, I'm making my mindset so an idea of the referee. So I won't be sending a paper again to the referee, for instance. Same for text generated, right? So we know that for copy editing and that sort of things, perhaps you wouldn't even need nowadays to report using AIs, and that's like there's like a substantial amount of text generation and that sort of things. Not for images, of course. But at the same time, we wouldn't have any proof to say, okay, well, this is now AI generated, and that's why we would, you know, take any sort of action from an editorial point of view. It would be to need like we would need to have like lots of other checks in place to prove that. So it is still trust-based, but we do, by experience, kind of detect these red flags, as people would say.
Certainly. And I think it's a great point. Highlighting about the trust base, it reminds me very similar to kind of authorship policies. People ask, how can we really, prove that there's gift authorship? Well, it's more based on the trust that we assume that people understand the policies and the people added to paper are those that meet the authorship criteria. So I do think it's also related to the AI use as well. One thing I do want to highlight for those of you joining us, Geppetto, that Sandra had mentioned is a AI software we've developed to try to detect AI generated text. And one very common misconception I've seen in the research community when I do these workshops is related to paper mills. And paper mills are these fake papers that are generated by companies, and often now with AI even more prevalent than they used to be. And that's why I think as publishers, it's really crucial for us to be able to determine what's being generated by AI versus humans. Surprisingly to me, when I do these workshops worldwide, so many researchers have never heard of paper mills. When I bring that up, I ask who's heard of them. Very few people have heard of them. They're shocked to know that there are fake papers out there. And it's hard as a reader to know when you're downloading an article, is this something trustworthy or is it something fabricated? And especially if you're going to be building your research upon it. And I think that's why these tools are really crucial. It's really trying to protect the integrity of the academic record overall. Yeah, thank you very much for your insights, both of you. So now I'd like to hear from the researcher side, another question related to ethics, integrity, and accountability. And that is, do you feel are the potential long-term effects of AI on researchers' writing abilities? And I'll first ask Veinard if you can please share some of your perspectives. You're muted, Veinard. Sorry.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So interestingly enough, the studies are actually starting to show that the long-term effects of AI content generation on researchers' writing is more detrimental than beneficial. AI content generation often leads to researchers generating large portions of content which they do not critically assess or at sometimes not even read back to themselves, and just trusting that what AI generated was good enough and exactly what they asked. And as a result, researchers are actually, and all of us are actually becoming lazy. Although in some cases we might have discovered something completely novel, something that we want to share with the world, the way that we share this sometimes takes away from that novelty. We start relying on AI content generation more, and as a result, we also don't learn to improve our own writing skills, or in some cases, we actually lose some of our own skills. And interestingly, Nature has recently published, and I can share these links, a few papers where they study the impacts of AI content generation on our cognitive abilities. And these results, although it differs in how you interpret all of it, but irrespective of how these studies were conducted, the results are almost, in all of them, the obvious results, the ones that we try to maybe ignore or deny in some cases, which shows that, well, firstly, it does show that efficiency increases, which makes sense. You can generate a lot more content a lot quicker. Also, what's interesting is the presentation and the logic of of the content also gets better, because AI does have a way of starting from first principles and working all the way down to a logical conclusion. But as an effect, these studies also show that we lose our way of critical thinking. We become lazy and almost over-reliant on AI. And what's interesting is it also affects our motivation and leads to a lower sense of value and purpose. We feel that we didn't really contribute to the body of knowledge, since we are emotionally disconnected to what the AI has generated. So in summary, in the short term, the effects are positive and endorphin-fold. In the medium term, the effects are founded in uncertainty, some uncertainty of one's actual contribution and if it's good enough. And overwhelmingly, the long-term effects are negative, since we are emotionally disconnected to our own work, and our writing abilities will actually start stagnating. So that would be my view on the writing abilities long term.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to highlight, for those of you joining us, there is a great editorial that was published this year in Nature Reviews Bioengineering called Writing is Thinking. But the whole idea that when you're taking the time to write your ideas, it slows down your thinking process and allows you to connect ideas together you may not have recognized before. And again, outsourcing that to AI means we're actually losing some of those key thinking principles that Bernard had just mentioned as well. So now I'd like to ask Kumar, so what are some of your perspectives and insights that you'd like to share on the effects of AI on researchers' writing abilities?
This is something which I think about a lot, because certainly from within my institution and wider, often the discussion around AI is on the practical use and how to regulate it to ensure that it's used ethically, both from a research perspective but also from an education perspective. And I don't think we talk enough about what the potential long-term effects are of a dependence on AI tools. And we can only predict what the long-term effects are going to be, because really it's only been in widespread availability for the past 2 to 3 years. So we haven't really no way of knowing what the long-term effects are going to be. But certainly in kind of subjects like mine, so I'm a lecturer in biomedical science, there's been a lot of concern around the potential de-skilling of future scientists. So this is not just in terms of writing, but as you said, Jeff, in terms of linking writing abilities to thinking abilities. And so there might be that potential de-skilling that might be happening if they lack that crucial kind of critical thinking skills and have that high dependence on technology for completing research-related tasks. But I think more broadly than that, I'm a dementia researcher, and I worry about the long-term effects of AI on cognitive abilities more broadly. We know that using our brains and developing and maintaining critical thinking skills, it's there as a protective factor against dementia in later life. There's a lot of evidence for that through building a cognitive reserve and building a resilience that protects us to a degree in later life. And the risk is that potentially substituting our cognitive abilities through that over-reliance on AI tools could potentially be putting us at greater risk of something like dementia in later life. And like I said, we just don't know what those potential long-term effects might be. So I think we need to be optimistic about using AI and how it can lead to lots of efficiencies, but we also need to kind of have some caution as well, I think.
I think it's a great point. It is still very new. I mean, ChatGPT just came out, I guess, about 3 years ago this month. And so we don't know what those long-term effects are until we're much further down the road. But on the other hand, people don't want to get left behind. So everyone's kind of quickly jumping onto that bandwagon, using it. And we may find out the detrimental effects later on, which would be unfortunate. So we can be optimistic, but yeah, I think we need to be cautious as well. Yeah, great advice, Kumar. So now we're going to move on to our fourth theme, focus on data security, privacy, and intellectual property. And I'll bring this back to you, Kumar, again. So how can researchers select AI tools responsibly to safeguard data security, confidentiality, and intellectual property, which is really crucial for researchers?
It definitely is. And this is something I touched on a little bit earlier about how we need to really think about especially with unpublished research, what we're actually willing to submit to one of these AI tools. And I think the best place to start is by looking at what's recommended by your institution, especially if you're wanting to use AI within your research in whatever way that might be. I would really recommend speaking with people that are in your IT department or within your information security or governance department, because there might already be agreements in place with certain software, certain tools that to a degree will safeguard some of your information if those agreements are in place. I guess it depends on how you're comfortable with having your information being used by these tools that will then help you decide which one for you is suitable. But I definitely think that the best place to start off with is having that discussion with people that are responsible for these things within your institution.
Yeah, I think it's really important. A lot of researchers do need to understand that data collected at an institution does belong to the institution, not to the researcher. They do need to comply with institutional policies. So I think being aware of what those policies are before using these tools is a great first step. Yeah, great recommendation. Thank you very much, Kumar. And Bernard, so from your perspective, what would be some additional recommendations or advice you could give?
Okay, so first of all, I want to 100% agree with what Kumar said. The best tools are actually often the ones that your own institution manages, especially if the data is saved on local servers, or just what your institution either supports or recommends. In some cases, and I've seen this before, institutions might have a sort of a shared account, and you can log in as a user or as a user from that institution, which helps a lot because then the legal and the privacy issues are all dealt on an institutional level, and you don't have to worry too much about it. If this is not available, what I usually do is I just go for the industry leaders like OpenAI, Microsoft, and the reasoning is because their policies are written for the public, so it's very easy to understand, very easy to interpret, and also easy to find. So that helps a lot. One trick that I've sort of maybe learned, because I'm also working in an industry where the information is quite sensitive, is you can also combine your queries. You can use more than one tool. So what you can do is you can use one tool for all the sensitive queries, and just for the less sensitive queries, you basically use another tool. And if you implement this strategy cleverly, the vagueness, there will be quite a vagueness between the two tools, of what exactly you are working on or where you're going with your questions. For example, you can ask the first tool a very technical question: how do I physically implement technology in technology A into technology B, and how is this done technically? And maybe in another tool, without referring to that suggested implementation, you can ask it where this implementation of these two technologies can be used, or where in the military environment, for example, it can be used. And then if you do this cleverly enough, the two questions will be sort of generic for both tools. So I've done that before, and it seems to work quite well. You can split the questions between the two. But I think we must also realize that unless we develop and train these tools ourselves, we will always have limited control over what happens to our data or where we get our answers from. So where the data was harvested, or if there was an internal bias. So I think it's also just important to realize that as you write.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I really like the divide and conquer approach, I'll call it, using multiple tools to really handle these more complex questions. I think you also highlighted a good point about some of the industry leaders. I think one of the advantages they may have is because they're in the public eye so much, they're under a lot more scrutiny, and therefore they have to be more careful with how they develop policies because they know they're going to be be available to a lot more people. But one thing a lot of people are not aware of is that even for example, ChatGPT, even temporary chat, they're stored on their servers for 30 days before being deleted. And so there is always those potential chances of data breaches and data leaks And I think people sometimes think just because they pick a temporary chat that information is not stored when it actually, in fact, can be. And that brings me to an interesting follow-up question for both of you. And I'll first continue on with you, Bernard, are there any tools you might recommend researchers to avoid in terms of data security or confidentiality?
So I pondered this question quite a bit, and it's unfortunately it's a multifaceted answer. So I would essentially, and it's a short answer, I would avoid digging too deep. I almost want to say, and maybe there's someone else who has maybe a little bit of a better strategy than I have, because I'm working in a sensitive environment. Some of these smaller companies that's very difficult to place where they are from, where they're operating from, where the data is saved. You can sort of spot which ones doesn't look that kosher to you. That's why I mentioned a little bit earlier that I try to use the publicly known ones. But I don't know if there's maybe someone else that has a better suggestion, then you're welcome to direct the question.
Well, I'll ask Kamar if you might have any suggestions that could help the researchers joining us today.
I wouldn't kind of say that there are any specific tools to avoid, but maybe there's obviously the ones that are the most popular ones that we all know about. But I think that any that are kind of, when we're talking about research, any that are the free public versions, they will often be the ones that will lack the sufficient security and a protection that you might want when handling anything to do with your research. So certainly go for the ones that are the most popular and well known, because you have more confidence in them. But I would certainly, as we mentioned, see what the institutional recommendations are for your particular university or institution. And usually if there are agreements in place, then there'll be some contracts that, means that you kind of then avoid the public free versions, I think, of whatever software you choose to go with.
Certainly. I think it's just, talking to people and being especially aware of institutional policies and guidelines can help be a really good guidance for a lot of researchers. Thank you very much, Kumar. So now let's get to some advice on data security, privacy, and intellectual property from our publishing colleagues. So I'll first ask Ellie. So how can authors ensure compliance with copyright, privacy, and confidentiality rules when using AI?
Thanks, Jeff. I think the simple answer is exactly the same way they would do it when they're not using AI. Like, would you tell a stranger on a bus this information? Probably not. So don't pick a stranger on the internet and share the same information. I think Kamar and Vinod both gave good examples of, not sort of giving away or, not actually valuing the asset that you have in that IP and that knowledge that you've created, but also being aware that in creating that, you might have used, there might be vulnerable participants of your research study, and you then have a responsibility to safeguard their information and their data. Equally, you might have used a third-party survey or a questionnaire or a tool that you would normally have to seek copyright to publish. And I think sometimes researchers don't think about those things until the work is published. So they've kind of bought themselves a grace period whilst the paper is in peer review, and they might have some feedback from reviewers or the editor saying, "Oh, hang on a minute, I think you might have needed to seek permission to use this," or I can't see that you've asked for third-party rights clearance on this image. Can we go back and sort that out? And that's the kind of time to polish and refine. But if you've already thrown all of those things into an AI tool and you aren't aware of how they're going to use that or who has access to it, or indeed what your institutional guidelines on that are, you're opening yourself up to risk, because as the author, you will be ultimately responsible for those actions. So it's really, really important that if you aren't sure about using a tool, or if you aren't sure whether the data will be secure or whether you'll be breaching copyright or something, to check with your institution or check with your publisher, and they can kind of help and give you some guidance on that. Don't try and wing it and hope for the best, because the buck will stop with you ultimately.
Yeah, Fantastic. I think really being forward thinking and really considering this at the design stage of your research, so you're not in the whoops, later on and realize there's not much you can do at that point. Yeah, great advice, Ellie. So, Sadrar, do you have any recommendations that could help researchers navigate this very tricky area?
Yeah, I think choosing the right tool is perhaps one of the most important ones. Going with the institutional ones, as has been mentioned before, I think it's one of the safest way, because the terms of services of some of these tools are a bit different from each other. You don't want to give ownership of your work directly by just feeding your work to them. So ideally, not ideally, you should basically avoid like inputting any copyrighted personal or unpublished material in that sense. Another thing is that you have to take ownership of the work. So you still have to keep full editorial control. And if there are any suggestions, you should revise them, check them, cross-check them, validate any eventual sources or citations and so on. An even better step is that if you want to use it, ideally you log all the AI interactions that you had, model, what was the prompts, what was the output, and so on. And perhaps the most important one is the disclosure. So you have to be transparent about the usage of that and mention this. So if you have used this in papers, you should mention it either as an acknowledgement or as a method, as you would do with any other tool, basically.
Right. I think really think keeping count both transparency and accountability is really crucial to navigate this. Great advice, Sadrar. Well, that brings us to our last theme, where we have two questions. The first one themes on transparency and disclosure we just touched upon. And so I'll ask Bernard from a researcher's perspective. So when should AI use be declared in academic writing, for example, for editing, paraphrasing, or language correction, or for more complicated issues such as computational, analytical, or methodological assistance?
Thanks, Jeff. So the nice thing is the answer to this question is becoming a lot easier to find and to manage. And due to the quick progress of AI, these policies are being developed with equal urgency. There might be some lag as expected. But as an example, in a recent paper that we published, the journal template had an instruction the template had the instruction under I think it was the acknowledgement section, of exactly what should be declared and how. And this sort of not only helps one remind one to declare the AI use, but also to know and to understand exactly what to declare. As a rule of thumb, and this is not just with AI use, this is with figures or tables or paraphrasing, and in my own experience, I would declare as much as possible, or anywhere that an AI tool was used, because it's safer to do so and either be, let's say, rejected or just directed early on than having to explain it after a publication has been published. So editors will also often ask you to maybe change the information that they feel that AI was maybe excessively or incorrectly used, as opposed to outrightly just rejecting it. So it helps to work together with the reviewers and the editors. You can see in the Springer policies, this is one of the best examples, I think, that I've seen, where you can clearly see that they're working from a standpoint of they want the author and the journal to work together to find the best way for you to share your knowledge, as opposed to a strict one-sided way of doing things. So try and find a middle ground and a solution, as opposed to trying to hide it and having to defend your decisions later when the work's already published and read by numerous peers in the field. And I also feel that just quickly declaring the use of AI in Liner also has an interesting effect for me, at least, that as you write, it sort of also helps you to decide whether you're personally relying on it a bit too much. It forces you to take the moral high ground during your own writing, and it might even push you to lessen your reliance on the tools. Which is longer term benefits and an increased sense of purpose and achievement. So I think if you're uncertain of what the journal's policies are, you can also always reach out to them and ask about it. If they don't have a policy, I would also suggest reaching out and talking about it. But in these cases, it's much better to be proactive than reactive.
Yeah, I agree. I think being open and transparent is really crucial.
Exactly.
But I also like your suggestion about helps you to self-assess your own use to see if it needs any correction as well going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, great points. So Dar, so from an editorial perspective, what would be some advice you'd give to maybe authors submitting to some of your journals?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting this question a lot, whether to use or not to use in general for writing. I mean, I wouldn't discourage people using it, especially for researcher with non-English speaking backgrounds, basically. But as mentioned before, like in terms of transparency, I totally agree with one. And so as much as possible, it is being disclosed is better. And as we also discussed in the past, I think which also resonates to the editorial that you were mentioning, writing is thinking. So because we think a lot, but usually the way that we think is, you know, in a very chaotic manner. But when we sit and write, it allows us to basically put all our thoughts in a more organized way. So that's the one effort that allows us to put all our thought in a more logical and clear way on paper. So I think it's a pity to, you know, to somehow not allow ourselves to go through this effort in a way. So even if we don't know how to write in English, it's better to write the whole text in our own language and then translate it so that the effort of writing is still there, because it actually allows us to find the gaps in our thinking. And it is something that ideally you don't want a machine to do on your behalf. But in terms of like policy, I mean, you know, like everything as much as possible, of course, is better, but copy editing nowadays is also perhaps not required. So if you're just like using it for, you know, improve readability, style, and so on, this might not be needed, or to improve, like, you know, to check for grammar, tones, and so on. But if there's more like generative editorial work, so there's substantial text generation, then you should, of course, and not for figures. Not for figures. This is still a red flag, unless it is just, you know, some very small graphical illustration that you want to put alongside the cover letter when you're submitting it, but this won't be published, right? So this is just for you, you know, you want us to better understand what's the main message of your paper, basically. But we could also do without, if it's nice.
Yeah, some of the great points. And one thing I'd like to recommend and just highlight to the researchers joining us today, the policy surrounding disclosure of AI does vary by publisher, and there's not a lot of agreement across publishers. And they're constantly evolving as well. I do encourage you always to look at the up-to-date policies about disclosure prior to submission, just so you're aware of what the editorial expectations are. And so that brings us to our final question. And first direct this to Ellie, related to transparency, disclosure, and authorship. So how would you recommend citing the use of AI transparently and ethically in a research paper?
Yeah, I think, as you say, the publisher policies can vary, but I think I agree with Vinard in actually over-declare rather than under. You can always trim down the declaration, but adding to it sort of post-publication never looks great. So that would be my first point. And my second one is actually, I've given this quite a bit of thought, thinking, what would I want to see in that declaration? And it's 5 things. It's declare what has been used, declare how it's been used. Then I want a statement on how it's been verified, refined, corrected. So explaining your input into that. An acknowledgement of any bias or inaccuracy that you're aware of, that the tool has introduced or may have generated. And then finally, just take responsibility. So a closing statement that says, you know, this is what I've done, this is how I've done it, and I take ultimate responsibility for everything in this paper. And then at the end, it's very, very clear. If people want to, they sort of say, oh, you didn't really need to say that you used it here. At least you're being very transparent for the peer review of your paper. There's no doubt in the editor's mind or the peer reviewer's mind oh, have they used ChatGPT to write this paper? No, they've just used Grammarly to polish it up. That we know. Let's move on. So I think just being really clear, and as you say, Ivana, it kind of Sadra, it kind of helps you organise your thoughts on what have you done. You know, what was your input? Are you taking ownership of that? And that part about acknowledging the bias or the inaccuracies as well kind of helps the whole ecosystem to learn what contribution AI can and can't give to that process.
Yeah, I agree. I think over disclosing is a lot better than undisclosing. It shows that transparency and honesty, you know, as Sidar had mentioned earlier about the trust that you were trying to develop in the research community. This is a great way to establish that trust. And so that does bring us to Sidar. So what recommendations would you give to researchers about citing the use of AI in their papers?
I think Ali's answers is pretty complete, actually. I mean, I would perhaps add the way that researchers are disclosing their usage. So I'll just read through an example of how people are doing so. I mean, we wouldn't mind a bit more information alongside like what Ellie was mentioning, but basically the way that it would read was like, is while preparing this work, we used a certain tool, ChatGPT or whatever, to improve the readability and language of the manuscript. And after using this tool, we reviewed and edited the content as needed and take full responsibility for the publication's content. So at least like 3-4 out of the 5 bits that Ellie was mentioning, they are there. Perhaps not with so many specifics, and ideally we would also want to have them, but that's basically the overall message we want to see disclosed.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing. So that brings us to the pre-registered questions. We have a little bit of time for some live questions, and we had a lot of similarities in the questions that were coming together. Our colleagues were able to kind of synthesize it into a concrete question. We're going to make this a kind of a quick fire, so just 1 or 2 quick tips. And the question is, you know, with generative AI being used so frequently amongst researchers around the world, what are some concrete and productive ways that we can effectively use AI to improve our writing and research output? Maybe if you can just give 1 or 2, you know, concrete tips that could support the people joining us today. And I'll start with you, Bernard.
Jeff, I think my main feedback would be using AI as a tool for yourself to improve your own writing. A strategy could be not generating large amounts of content, but working sentence by sentence. You write your own content, you feed back sentence by sentence. If you want AI to improve it, you give it clear instructions on exactly what you want it to have improved. And then also you read back what AI has given you so that you also learn from your own queries. So that would be my quick fire answer is use it in small portions and try and learn as well. Try and learn from it and also increasing your writing abilities in the process.
Yeah, I think great point. We can learn from the changes that are made to make us ourselves better writers, less reliant on these tools going forward. Kamar, so what would be your 1 or 2 concrete tips to help researchers use the AI effectively?
So for me, it wouldn't necessarily be kind of how much you're using it or what you're using it for, because I think you can use it as much as you want, but for me, it's kind of how you're using it. And I think it can be really useful for making certain tasks more efficient, synthesizing your notes and information, generating ideas, or before you kind of come to the content of writing. So I think that, you know, using it frequently is fine, but maybe thinking about how you're using it, maybe trying avoiding it for the generation of actual content. So you're preserving your voice and you're not compromising on those things we talked about, but making certain tasks more efficient.
Yeah, I think to kind of address those kind of more remedial or mundane tasks, or I think maybe using it as a thought partner to bounce ideas off of before you decide what you want to communicate. And last but certainly not least, Sidar, do you have any 1 or 2 quick tips in the last minute we have today?
I mean, like other than just like perhaps copy editing, summarizing things that we know they are very good at, I found that some of these LLMs are also quite good to for brainstorming. So you have one perspective of viewing a thing, and then you ask them for an additional perspective or more additional perspectives. So brainstorming, getting bullet points, ideas, trying to find alternative explanations and linking connections, these things that we may not be able to think about, like looking at it as an assistant, I think could be useful with supervision, of course.
Yeah, I think it's great. And that kind of echoes similar to what Kumar was mentioning about using it before you actually writing the paper as kind of more of a thought partner type of aspect. Well, wonderful. So that does bring us to the end of our live questions. And we'd like to make sure that all the resources, including the webinars, are tailored to you and your needs. So we'd be very grateful if you could take a few moments just to complete the survey that's linked on the screen as well as in the chat. And a brief reminder of the scientific writing and publishing course series that are published on our platform. We'll be able to further improve your confidence on these topics. And you can access the series via the QR codes and the links on your screen. And you'll also receive a link in a post-webinar email as well. So finally, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. And a warm thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for helping us to bring this topic to life. So with that, thank you everyone involved, and I hope everyone has a great day ahead and best of luck throughout your careers.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.